The sky over Seattle that morning was the color of wet slate, heavy and close, pressing down on the crowd that clustered around Margaret's grave. Rain battered the line of black umbrellas, slicking the headstones and soaking through the knees of my old slacks, but I barely noticed. Every sound, every scent, felt like it came from underwater, except the sting of the silver cross digging into my palm, the one Margaret had worn every day since our honeymoon. I'd slipped it off her neck with hands that shook so hard I nearly dropped it in the hospital parking lot. That cross was the only thing grounding me, the only thing that felt real. Margaret's funeral should have been a solemn day. But if you'd looked close, you'd have seen something off. Maybe it was the tension in the air, the kind that hums in your bones before a thunderstorm. Maybe it was the way the crows screamed from the power lines, or the way my son's wife, Emma, swept down the gravel path in a dress the color of a bleeding heart. Fire truck red, silk that shimmered like she was headed to a gala, not a grave. Emma wasn't crying. She was smiling. It was the kind of smile you see on TV right before a plot twist. Her lips were slick with crimson lipstick, her heels spiked and gleaming. She leaned into my son, Adam, who looked everywhere but at me. I heard her whisper, clear as a bell, "This day is like a holiday." Then she tossed her hair and giggled, like she just told a dirty joke at a cocktail party. Adam snorted, low and nervous, like he couldn't help himself. Something inside me locked up. My body stayed still, eyes fixed on the casket lowering into the ground. But my mind fractured, split wide open by that word, holiday. How could she? How could they? The people standing behind me stiffened, shifting awkwardly in their shoes. Mrs. Keating, Margaret's oldest friend, sucked in a shocked breath, her hand flying to her chest. I could hear her whisper to her husband, "Is she serious?" It echoed the scream rising in my throat. I wanted to shout, to demand how they could treat this day, Margaret's day, as anything less than sacred. But I kept quiet, feeling the weight of 40 years of marriage and sacrifice settling onto my shoulders. Margaret would have wanted dignity. Dignity was all I had left. The priest's words about peace, about eternal life, blurred in my ears, washed out by the rain and my own pulse pounding in my head. My son's face was pale, his jaw tight. Emma's red dress seemed to glow against the black, like a siren in a storm, an omen I wished I could ignore. The umbrellas bobbed and jostled, people whispering in clumps, glancing over their shoulders at Emma as she whispered again to Adam. Their hands joined, already dividing the world without Margaret in it. When the service ended, the crowd drifted away quickly, umbrellas tilting into the wind. I stood at the grave, feeling the damp earth soak through my shoes, watching Margaret's name disappear beneath fresh mud and bouquets already drooping in the drizzle. I waited until I was alone. I waited until I couldn't hear the distant hum of traffic, until even the crows had flown. Only then did I let the cross dangle from my hand and stare down at the grave. "Don't let them break you," Margaret used to say. I'd heard her voice in my head 1,000 times before, but now it sounded more like a warning than a comfort. I slipped the cross into my pocket, and in that moment, something hard and cold settled inside me. I didn't know what it was, only that it felt like the beginning of something dangerous. Back at home, the house was empty in a way it had never been before. The couch still smelled faintly of Margaret's lavender lotion, and the old photo on the mantel. Adam at age 6, grinning with a front tooth missing, Margaret laughing at his side, stared back at me like a dare. Adam hadn't looked me in the eye in weeks. Lately, his calls had grown shorter, his visits more rare, as if he was already rehearsing a life that didn't include me. Emma had started dropping comments about the house, about the money, about how it was time for us to move forward. "You should think about selling," she'd say, swirling wine in the kitchen, her eyes never quite meeting mine. Margaret had warned me about her, warned me that Emma saw the world in dollars and decimal points, that she'd never love Adam the way a mother does, that she'd take everything if she was given half a chance. I hadn't listened. I'd wanted to believe Adam would see through her, that he'd remember everything I'd given, every job I'd worked, every birthday party I'd stayed up late baking cakes for. It was easier to believe a lie than admit your only son was slipping away. That night, the house seemed to shrink. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cross, feeling the ache of loneliness, and let the memories play out in my head like scenes from an old home movie. Adam's wedding, how I'd sold my first house, the one Margaret loved, just to pay for the ceremony. The realtor's handshake, the empty rooms, the way Margaret squeezed my hand and said, "It's worth it for him." I'd agreed. I always agreed. I don't remember how long I sat there, lost in thought, the rain thrumming against the windows. At some point I picked up Margaret's old leather notebook, the one she kept on her bedside table. I flipped through the pages, finding recipes, phone numbers, prayers she'd written late at night. One word caught my eye, underlined in her neat, looping handwriting: justice. The word didn't look angry. It looked patient, like she knew this day would come. I closed the notebook, heart pounding. That one word felt like a sign or maybe a challenge. Margaret had seen this coming, and she'd trusted me to do what she couldn't. The next day, I woke up with a headache and a sense that I'd missed something obvious. The house was silent, the world outside cold and gray. But I wasn't tired anymore. I was angry, and under the anger something sharper, determination maybe, or the bone-deep need to make things right. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the rain wash down the driveway. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling. Emma's social media was a gallery of champagne glasses, designer shoes, photos of their new BMW, and Adam in expensive suits, grinning a little too wide. I started taking notes, bank names, vacation dates, receipts half visible in the background of their photos. They were already spending money they didn't have, money they thought was theirs. I made a list. I opened Margaret's notebook and started writing. Justice, I wrote, underlining it twice. Something shifted in me, something that felt like waking up after years of sleep. I dialed a number I hadn't used in years, an old friend from my days at Boeing, a guy who owed me more than one favor. "Tom, it's me. I need a little help." He didn't ask questions. I didn't explain. Some things don't need words. By nightfall, the air in the house felt lighter, as if Margaret was watching and approving. I still didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since the funeral I felt like myself again. I stayed up late, reading through old documents, digging out the deed to the house, tracing my finger over the line where my name sat alone, no longer paired with Margaret's. I wrote another note in her notebook: "Don't let them win." I set it beside the cross on the table, a promise to her and to myself. The next morning, I dressed in my best shirt, the one Margaret had always liked, and walked out into the drizzle. I headed for the law office downtown, the one with the dusty windows and brass sign out front. The receptionist barely looked up when I walked in, but the lawyer, Miss Sutton, did. She smiled gently, her eyes soft but sharp. "Mr. Harris, I'm sorry for your loss. I think Margaret left something for you." The room was small and warm, but the words she handed me felt enormous. "Your wife wanted you to know, whatever happens, you're not alone. She planned for this." She pushed a folder across the desk, her hands steady. I felt a rush of something like hope, an energy I hadn't known in years. Margaret had seen through everything, even from the other side. I left the office with a strange feeling buzzing in my chest. Out on the sidewalk, the rain had stopped and the clouds were breaking apart. The world looked brighter, sharper, more dangerous. Something big was coming. I could feel it, the way you feel an earthquake rumbling under your feet before anyone else notices. I walked back home, the cross in my pocket, the notebook under my arm, and for the first time, I smiled. The rain hadn't let up by the time I made it home that afternoon, just got softer, misting the window panes with a thin, relentless drizzle that turned the streets outside my small house into black ribbons. For hours, I sat at the kitchen table tracing the worn edge of Margaret's cross, letting the silence press in all around me. The ticking of the old wall clock marked the seconds since the funeral, and each tick landed like a stone in my chest. I didn't bother with the lights. Margaret's favorite lamp glowed softly in the corner, left on since the night before, casting a golden halo over her photograph on the mantel. She was smiling in that picture, her hair caught in the breeze, her eyes shining like she was caught mid-laugh. Adam was in the frame too, a gap-toothed boy with grass stains on his jeans and a wild, joyful grin. I remembered taking that photo at Lake Chelan, back when summer still meant something, before the weight of adulthood and distance pressed between us. Now the house felt too big, too empty. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, only accuses. I wandered through the living room, picking up objects at random: Margaret's old reading glasses, a half-finished crossword puzzle, a faded grocery list in her neat handwriting. Each piece was a small wound. Her scent still lingered, lavender and clean cotton, clinging to the fabric of her favorite chair. I caught myself talking to her in whispers, as if she might answer from the next room. Grief made the world tilt, made memories sharper than the ache in my chest. I thought about Adam, about the man he'd become, the boy I'd worked myself raw to raise. I'd spent years on graveyard shifts at the mill, then put in hours as a janitor just to keep him in private school, making sure he had what other kids took for granted. Margaret always believed in him, always told me that someday it would all make sense. She never complained about the sacrifices, not when we ate beans for weeks, not when I sold my first house, the house we'd bought after the wedding with the creaking porch and the crooked mailbox, just to pay for Adam's wedding to Emma. I'd watched the moving truck pull away from the curb, watched Margaret wipe her eyes and tell me, "It's worth it for Adam." I wanted to believe it. I had to. But lately, every memory felt like it belonged to someone else. Adam's visits had grown shorter, his calls clipped, as if he had somewhere more important to be. I'd catch him glancing at his watch when we met for coffee, fielding texts from Emma, who never stayed long enough to finish a conversation. Emma, her voice, her laugh, her cutting remarks, echoed through the halls of our family like a warning bell. Margaret had seen it first, had tried to tell me. "She's not who you think, David," she'd said one night as we lay in bed listening to the rain. "She'll take everything if you let her." I hadn't wanted to hear it. I'd wanted peace. I told myself Adam was smart, that he'd see through her ambition. But what do you do when your only child drifts so far you can barely recognize him? That night, sleep wouldn't come. I wandered the house, checking doors, rearranging books, listening to the clock. I found myself drawn to Margaret's bedside table, her leather notebook still there, the cover creased from years of use. I thumbed through pages of grocery lists, recipes, prayers, and then stopped at a word written in her careful hand, underlined twice: justice. That word sent a chill through me. Margaret had always believed in fairness, had always said the world needed more of it. I read it again and again, feeling as if she were trying to speak to me from somewhere beyond my grief. I stared at the ceiling, the shadows moving across the paint, and wondered if justice was even possible anymore. The next morning, the world outside was just as gray. The mail arrived late, a stack of bills and sympathy cards, one envelope addressed in Margaret's handwriting. My heart stopped when I saw it, the return address our own. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter she'd written months before, tucked away for me to find after she was gone. Her words were gentle, but there was steel beneath them. She told me not to let grief swallow me, not to give up on Adam, but also not to let anyone, no matter how close, turn kindness into weakness. She ended with a reminder: "You are stronger than you think. Don't let them decide what happens next. I trust you." That letter was a jolt of cold water. I realized then how much I'd let life shape me instead of the other way around. Margaret had built me up for decades. She wasn't going to let me collapse now. I made coffee, black and bitter, and sat by the window watching the neighbors' kids walk to school, backpacks bouncing. I envied their innocence, the way they believed the world would always make sense. I wrote a note in Margaret's notebook, my handwriting shaky. "Justice," I underlined. "For her. For me." After lunch, I started going through old files. Bank statements, insurance papers, the deed to the house, Margaret's will. I realized, for the first time, how little I really knew about what we had left. Adam and Emma had always assumed the estate would go to them. Lately, Emma had made suggestions about moving forward, about taking care of things. Her words like little knives in a velvet pouch. I'd shrugged her off, not wanting conflict. I started making a list of everything Margaret had left behind. Every dollar, every account, every little secret stash she'd kept hidden for Christmases or emergencies. A heaviness settled over me as I worked, a sense that something had been set in motion that couldn't be undone. I opened Adam's old yearbooks, found the one from high school where he'd been voted most likely to succeed. His smile was bright and careless. What had happened to that boy? I stared at the photo for a long time, asking questions I couldn't answer. When the phone rang, I jumped. It was Miss Sutton, Margaret's lawyer, her voice calm and precise. She told me there were things we needed to discuss, things Margaret had prepared before her illness got worse. She said Margaret had wanted to make sure everything was handled with clarity and fairness. The words sounded like code, as if there was something more beneath the surface. I made an appointment for the next afternoon, my mind already racing. That night, I dreamed of Margaret standing in the kitchen, the cross around her neck, her hair pulled back the way she wore it for church. She was writing in her notebook, pausing to look up at me, her eyes kind but serious. I woke with her voice in my ears, saying, "Don't let them break you." I sat at the table with a mug of coffee, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on me. But beneath the sadness, I felt something else. Not anger, not fear. Something quieter, steadier. A sense that Margaret was still with me, that her faith in justice was mine to carry. I stared out the window, rain blurring the world, and made a silent promise. I would not let Adam and Emma decide my future. I would not let Margaret's sacrifices be wasted. Whatever happened next, I was ready to face it. It's funny how grief sharpens your senses instead of dulling them. I never would have believed it before, but the week after Margaret's funeral, everything around me felt heightened, raw, bright, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was the kind of restlessness that wakes you in the night, makes you pace the floor until your joints ache, your mind tangled in questions that never seem to end. I barely slept, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I didn't trust what daylight would bring. Adam and Emma had barely given me space to mourn. 2 days after the funeral, Adam called to check in, his voice careful, overly sweet, as if he were talking to a client. He talked a little about Margaret, but mostly about what's next, and how hard things would be now that we were all on our own. He kept mentioning bills, the house, and planning for the future. Emma didn't bother with the pretense. She sent me a single text, a list of Margaret's jewelry, asking if she could have the sapphire earrings. She didn't even bother to call. It stung in a way I hadn't expected, and for a moment, I was tempted to answer, to snap at her for her shameless greed. But I didn't. I just set the phone down and stared at the shadows moving across the living room floor, feeling something inside me settle. A heavy certainty that nothing would ever be the same. With Margaret gone, the house seemed to shrink and expand in turns. Some days, it felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating me with the scent of old perfume and the distant echo of laughter. Other times, it felt impossibly empty, as if I were the last survivor in a city built for ghosts. The only constant was the cross in my pocket and Margaret's notebook on the table, her handwriting looping across the pages, daring me to do something more than just endure. On a gray Thursday, the phone rang. I picked it up expecting another condolence call, but it was Tom, the old friend from Boeing. His voice was quieter than usual, edged with something I didn't recognize. He said he'd been looking into things, just like I'd asked. "You were right to trust your gut," he told me. "There's more going on than you think." I pressed for details and Tom hesitated, then told me about Adam and Emma's spending, new credit cards, high balances, a vacation booked to Cabo in Emma's name weeks before Margaret's diagnosis. He'd also found something else. A joint account Adam had opened with Emma 3 months ago, moving money from Margaret's old insurance policy. None of this was technically illegal, but it was enough to make my pulse thunder in my ears. That sinking suspicion I'd ignored for years suddenly felt like the only truth I had left. I started to notice the patterns everywhere. Emma's Instagram was a stream of gold-plated brunches, designer handbags, rooftop parties, each photo tagged with Adam, their friends, and the city's trendiest hotspots. I zoomed in on one shot of Emma holding a glass of champagne, the reflection in her sunglasses showing Adam in the background, hunched over his phone, eyes tight. I wondered how long they'd been spending money that wasn't theirs. How long they'd been waiting for Margaret to die so they could live the life they thought they deserved. My anger didn't burn, it chilled. I wrote down every date, every detail, every transaction I could find. Bank statements, social media check-ins. A photo of Emma at a boutique opening wearing Margaret's old brooch. I built a case, page by page, in Margaret's notebook. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Adam and Emma weren't just careless. They were plotting. I remembered the way Emma had smiled at the funeral, her red dress so brazen against a sea of mourning. I remembered Adam's nervous laughter, the way he'd avoided my eyes. There was no question anymore. They had betrayed Margaret's memory. They were betraying me too. By the following weekend, I couldn't sit still. I walked the city, the rain slicking the sidewalks, my thoughts spinning. I dropped in on Margaret's lawyer, Ms. Sutton, without an appointment. She was in her office, glasses perched low, reading a file with an intensity that reminded me of Margaret when she was grading exams. I sat across from her and let the story pour out. Emma's text, Adam's call, Tom's findings, the bank transfers, everything. Miss Sutton listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she closed the file and leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me Margaret had come to see her 3 weeks before she died. Margaret had made some changes to her will. There was a clause, Miss Sutton said, that Adam and Emma knew nothing about. A stipulation that would change everything if they tried to claim her estate out of greed or deception. Margaret had foreseen it all. The relief that flooded me was tinged with shame. I doubted Margaret's strength. I'd underestimated the woman who had held our family together through every storm, who'd watched the way Emma eyed our possessions, who'd known Adam's weaknesses better than anyone, even me. Margaret had done what I couldn't. She'd protected us from ourselves. I thanked Miss Sutton and walked out into the drizzle. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a flicker of hope, like a single streetlight burning at the end of a dark alley. But I knew this wasn't over. Emma and Adam were moving faster than I could keep up. Their arrogance would be their downfall, but only if I played my hand right. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table, I pulled Margaret's notebook toward me. I wrote down the facts, drawing lines between names, dates, and transactions. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual, marking time as if the house itself was holding its breath. The list of betrayals grew. The evidence stacked higher. I realized I wasn't just gathering information. I was planning, not for revenge, but for something deeper. Justice, yes, but also closure. I needed Adam and Emma to see what they had become. I needed them to face the consequences of their choices. My mind kept circling back to Adam, to the son I'd loved beyond reason. The boy who used to hold my hand as we crossed busy streets, who called me Dad with a wonder I thought I'd never lose. I remembered teaching him to ride a bike in the alley behind our first apartment, his laughter echoing between the brick walls. When had that boy become this man, hiding secrets and lies? Had I done this to him, or had the world? The phone buzzed late that night. Another text from Emma, this time demanding an answer about the jewelry. I didn't reply. Instead, I took photos of everything valuable Margaret had left and locked them away in a safe deposit box at the credit union. I made copies of the will, the insurance paperwork, and kept them in 3 separate places. I wasn't going to be blindsided again. Days bled into each other and the tension grew. Adam and Emma called more often, their questions getting sharper, their impatience more obvious. They asked about the house, about the life insurance, about Margaret's pension, about making things easier for everyone. I gave them nothing but polite, empty words. Each conversation left me colder, more resolved. I started walking every evening, through the neighborhood Margaret had loved, past the bakery where we used to buy cinnamon rolls on Sundays. Sometimes I stopped at the park, sitting on a damp bench beneath a spreading oak, letting the rain soak through my coat. I would take out Margaret's notebook, feeling the outline of her words beneath my thumb. Sometimes I wrote my own thoughts, memories, regrets, plans. Felt like talking to her. It made the pain easier to bear. But beneath the quiet, something was building. A storm was coming. one that would sweep away the lies and leave only the truth behind. Adam and Emma were sure they'd already won. They had no idea how wrong they were. I was done playing the role of the broken widower. I was ready to fight, not just for Margaret's memory, but for what was right. I went home that night with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I checked the locks, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the rain. The cross hung heavy in my pocket, the notebook thick with secrets. I understood finally what Margaret had meant. Justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you made step by step, choice by choice. In the days that followed, Adam and Emma grew bolder. Their messages came at all hours, sometimes disguised as concern, sometimes not even pretending anymore. I began to answer with silence, letting their own impatience eat at them. I waited, watching, collecting. Every lie they told, every careless mistake. They were building their own undoing, brick by brick. When Tom called again, his voice was grim but satisfied. He'd found what we needed, a hidden account, funds funneled out of Margaret's insurance before she passed. Evidence enough to prove deceit, evidence that would change the reading of the will. I thanked him, my hands trembling with relief and anger and something that felt dangerously close to triumph. That night, I wrote one last note in Margaret's notebook. I told her what I'd done, what I'd found, and what I was about to do. I thanked her for her faith, her stubborn hope. I promised her justice, not revenge. As the rain battered the window, I realized I was no longer afraid of the storm. I was the storm now, and nothing would stop me from seeing this through. In the days that followed, the rain outside finally broke, and pale sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, catching on the dust that had settled since Margaret's funeral. I stood in the middle of the living room, clutching her old notebook, feeling the pulse of every plan and promise echo inside its worn pages. I had spent my whole life solving other people's problems. Margaret's worries, Adam's scraped knees and overdue bills. I had let myself become the backdrop of their lives, the silent figure keeping everything steady. But something in me had shifted. Grief and disappointment had forged a new kind of clarity. This wasn't going to be another quiet surrender. I had work to do. I started with the only ally I could trust, Miss Sutton, Margaret's lawyer. The day I arrived, she was waiting for me in her office, surrounded by neat stacks of files and a mug of tea gone cold. She greeted me with the same steadiness Margaret had always shown, her eyes warm but sharp behind her glasses. I laid everything out for her. The texts, the bank statements, the evidence Tom had collected, and the old will. She listened without interrupting, nodding at the right places, and when I was done, she opened a new folder and slid it across the desk. Margaret's revised will, signed and notarized 3 weeks before she died. The words were as clear as day. The bulk of her estate would go to a local children's charity she had supported for decades. Adam and Emma would only inherit if they honored her wishes, if they hadn't acted out of greed. There were instructions for distributing her jewelry, her books, even her grandmother's quilt, but the big money, every cent, was already spoken for. For the first time since Margaret's diagnosis, I felt something like hope crack through my chest. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but it was the certainty that Margaret had seen the danger coming and had built a wall high enough to keep it out. Miss Sutton explained the legal process, how Adam and Emma would be notified, how every transfer was airtight and final. I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. But I also felt a new burden, the responsibility to make sure Margaret's plans couldn't be undone by carelessness or spite. That afternoon, I made a dozen phone calls, each one a small battle in a larger war. I closed joint accounts, redirected life insurance payouts, transferred every penny Margaret had left in her personal checking into the charity fund. Each task was mechanical, but behind every signature and password, I heard Margaret's voice. Don't let them win. My hands shook sometimes, but I never stopped moving. I double-checked everything, taking photos of receipts, scanning every confirmation email, locking physical documents in a fireproof box in the back of my closet. I wasn't just protecting Margaret's legacy. I was reclaiming my own sense of purpose, one line item at a time. In the evenings, I walked the quiet neighborhoods near my house, letting my thoughts settle into a rhythm. I remembered the early years with Margaret, when we lived paycheck to paycheck in a two-bedroom apartment, counting out coins for groceries and scraping by on dreams. She had always found joy in small things. A perfect loaf of bread, a well-timed joke, the sound of Adam's laugh echoing from the backyard. I thought about the life we had built together, the risks we had taken, the sacrifices she had made so Adam could have choices. I remembered the long nights when I wondered if any of it mattered. Now I knew it did. But every step forward was shadowed by the memory of Adam and Emma's betrayal. I couldn't shake the image of them at the funeral. Emma's red dress a slash of cruelty, Adam's laugh cold and strange. Their calls and texts grew more insistent as the weeks passed. Emma started showing up unannounced, circling the house in her black SUV, waiting for a chance to corner me about family business. Adam's messages turned from polite concern to open frustration. He demanded to know about the estate, the insurance, the house. Each message stung, but it only made my resolve sharper. One morning, a white envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, just my name in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a photocopy of an offshore account statement with Emma's name at the top and a sum so large it made my breath catch. Money had been siphoned from joint accounts over the last year, enough to buy their new car, pay for expensive vacations, and pad an account in the Cayman Islands. There was also a note, "You deserve to know." My first thought was Tom, but I couldn't be sure. All that mattered was that the puzzle was coming together, and the picture it painted was uglier than I'd feared. I spent the next several days preparing. I hired a private investigator, a quiet, careful man named Alvarez recommended by Ms. Sutton. He moved quickly, tracing every wire transfer, every shadowy deal Emma had made behind Adam's back. By the end of the week, I had a stack of evidence. Photos, receipts, emails, that proved without a doubt that Emma was planning to cut Adam out as soon as she got the money. It was a betrayal within a betrayal, and I almost pitted Adam. Almost. The irony wasn't lost on me. 4 years, I had worried that Emma would take Adam for a ride, but I never imagined how thorough she would be. I remembered Margaret's last words to me in the hospital, her hand gripping mine. Protect our boy, even from himself. I understood now what she meant. Some lessons come too late. As the date for the reading of the will approached, the pressure built. Emma's texts became venomous, full of veiled threats and desperate pleas. Adam stopped calling altogether, retreating into a silence that hurt more than any accusation. I began to feel the edges of isolation closing in again, but I refused to give in. I wrote detailed instructions for Ms. Sutton, left copies of the evidence in safe places, and arranged for the charity to be notified the moment the will was read. Every contingency covered, every possible attack anticipated. The night before the reading, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, the cross and the notebook beside a cup of cold coffee, and stared at the silent phone. I felt Margaret's presence stronger than ever, as if she were standing in the doorway watching over me. I wanted to ask her for advice, for comfort, but all I could do was listen to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain starting up again. I wondered if Adam would ever forgive me. I wondered if I would ever forgive him. At dawn, I walked to the park where Margaret and I had spent so many Sunday mornings. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of new grass. I sat on our old bench and read the last page of her notebook, the page where she had written, "Do what's right, even when it's hard." The words felt like a blessing and a curse. I stood, squared my shoulders, and went home to face the day. The law office was cool and quiet when I arrived, the receptionist offering a gentle nod as I passed. Miss Sutton waited with the charity's lawyer, both women radiating a calm assurance that made my heart steady. Emma and Adam arrived together, but there was a visible distance between them, a coldness that hadn't been there before. Emma's eyes flashed with suspicion. Adam barely glanced at me. We gathered in the conference room, the will laid out on the table like a verdict. I watched Adam's hands shake as Miss Sutton began to read. Emma's mouth twisted with every word. When she realized what Margaret had done, when she understood that everything she'd plotted for was gone, her mask cracked. She let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a sob and a snarl, and stormed from the room, her heels echoing down the hallway. Adam sat in stunned silence, his shoulders caving in. I watched him, my heart torn between relief and regret. I left the office with the sun in my eyes and the cross warm in my pocket. Justice had been served, but it hadn't brought peace. Not yet. The finality of Margaret's decisions weighed on me, but beneath the ache was a flicker of pride. I had honored her wishes. I had kept my promise. As I walked home, the city seemed brighter, sharper. I realized that this was just the beginning, not of revenge, but of something cleaner. Closure, perhaps, or maybe the first step toward forgiveness. Whatever came next, I knew I was strong enough to face it. The day of reckoning arrived, cloaked in a thin, milky sunlight that barely warmed the pavement as I walked the 3 blocks from my house to Miss Sutton's office. My footsteps echoed on the cracked sidewalk, each one steadier than I expected, the old ache in my knee almost forgotten. I felt the weight of Margaret's cross in my pocket, the notebook tucked under my arm, and the strange anticipation that lives at the end of a long road. The sense that nothing can stop what's coming. Not anymore. I'd prepared for this moment in silence and secrecy, moving my pawns in the background while Adam and Emma reveled in their self-assurance. Now the board was set, and every decision, every sacrifice, every sleepless night had brought us all here. The waiting room was quiet, smelling faintly of coffee and lemon oil. I sat beneath a faded print of the Seattle skyline, heart ticking like a second hand. The receptionist nodded politely but didn't smile. Maybe she could sense the tension. Through the glass door, I watched Adam and Emma pull up in their silver SUV, her sunglasses reflecting the sky, his jaw set in that familiar mix of pride and worry. They didn't speak as they entered. Emma's heels clicked sharply against the tile. Adam trailed behind, his shoulders drawn tight. There was a coldness between them now, as if the ground beneath their feet was already shifting. We were ushered into Miss Sutton's conference room, a square, windowless space with a heavy table at its center. Sunlight tried to force its way through the high window, casting pale stripes across the folders spread before us. Emma took a seat on the far side, legs crossed, arms folded, the picture of composure. Adam fidgeted with his phone, knuckles white, avoiding my eyes. I let my gaze drift to the photographs on Miss Sutton's wall, Margaret's smile in one, a framed thank you letter from the children's charity in another, reminders of the lives that had shaped this moment. Miss Sutton began, her voice measured and clear, reading Margaret's last will and testament with a solemnity that felt both heavy and liberating. I listened for the sound of hope or remorse in Adam and Emma, but all I heard was the shuffle of paper and the faint humming of the building's air vent. Margaret's wishes unfolded in careful sentences. Her desire for every penny to go to the children's charity, her instructions for the family heirlooms, her faith in justice. Each word was a stone laid in the foundation of her legacy, a legacy built to withstand greed and betrayal. The moment of truth came in a single paragraph. Miss Sutton announced the charity's inheritance, the airtight transfer of funds, the legal shield Margaret had constructed. Emma's mask cracked. Her lips parted as if to argue, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. Color drained from her face, her poise unraveling, replaced by something raw and panicked. Adam stared at the table, breath shallow, cheeks burning. I watched the realization dawn in them both. There would be no windfall, no easy victory. Every plan they'd spun was collapsing. Emma's fury came in a flash, her voice sharp and brittle as she accused me of plotting, manipulating, stealing what was rightfully theirs. Adam tried to speak, but words died on his lips. He looked at me, eyes pleading for understanding or forgiveness or some way out. I offered neither. My silence was all the answer they deserved. When Emma stood, shoving her chair back with enough force to rattle the table, the room went silent except for the shuddering of her breath. She snatched her purse and stormed out, her exit as theatrical as her entrance. The door slammed, the echo lingering longer than she did. Adam didn't follow. He sat hunched over, hands pressed to his face, the reality settling in. For a long moment nobody moved. Miss Sutton's assistant quietly gathered papers, the room's energy heavy and spent. I found myself watching Adam, waiting for a spark of the boy I'd raised, the child who once trusted me completely. Instead, I saw a man drowning, undone by his own weakness and the company he'd chosen. There was no pleasure in it, no victory. Only the cold satisfaction of seeing Margaret's wishes fulfilled, her legacy protected from those who would have squandered it. After the meeting, I walked out into the parking lot, the city humming with ordinary life. I leaned against the rail, drawing a long breath, trying to find the edges of what I was supposed to feel. Relief? Anger? Vindication? What came was a strange quiet, a stillness in my chest that didn't quite feel like peace. Margaret's words returned to me. Do what's right, even when it's hard. But the cost was higher than I'd imagined. That evening, as dusk settled over the city, Adam showed up at my door. He stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, eyes red-rimmed and lost. For a moment, we stood in silence, the years between us stretching and snapping in the fading light. He stepped inside, hands trembling as he gripped the back of a chair, his voice raw and hesitant as he tried to explain, to apologize, to make sense of the mess he'd made. I listened, my heart heavy with memories and regret. He asked me for help, not for money, but for guidance, for forgiveness. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I had either left to give. I sat across from him at the kitchen table, Margaret's cross lying between us. Adam's confession spilled out in fits and starts. How he'd let Emma control him, how he'd lost sight of who he was, how he'd been afraid of disappointing everyone. I saw flashes of the boy I'd known, the son I'd tried so hard to save from the world's sharp edges. But I also saw a man who had chosen his path, who had turned away from family for the promise of something easier. Forgiveness, if it came, would take time. He left quietly, the front door closing with a soft click. I watched him go, not knowing if I'd ever see him the same way again. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat in the hush of the house, and tried to imagine what Margaret would have said. She'd always believed in second chances, but she'd never been blind to consequences. Maybe that was the real lesson. Justice isn't about revenge, but about facing what you've done and living with the outcome. Later, I met with Ms. Sutton and the charity representatives, signing the final documents, making sure every dollar Margaret had fought for was protected. The gratitude in their faces was humbling, a reminder that good could come from pain. I felt Margaret's presence in the room, her belief in me echoing through every word. I wasn't alone, not anymore. The city lights flickered on as I walked home, the sky deepening to indigo. I thought about Adam and Emma, where they would go, what they would do now that their plans had crumbled. I hoped Adam would find his way, would remember what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. As for Emma, I let her fade into the night, a lesson in greed and arrogance, a warning to those who believe the world owes them more than they deserve. At home, I sat with Margaret's notebook, tracing the pages she'd filled with hope and faith and quiet wisdom. The house was still, but I didn't feel empty. I felt anchored, for the first time in months. I poured a small glass of bourbon and raised it in the direction of her photo, a silent toast to resilience and the kind of love that refuses to be erased by bitterness or loss. In the end, it wasn't about money, or winning, or even punishment. It was about Margaret's belief that justice could outlast sorrow, that dignity could be restored even after everything else had been stripped away. I had been given the chance to prove her right. I had taken it, and now, whatever the future brought, I would meet it on my own terms. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen window that morning, the kind of golden light that feels rare in Seattle after a long, gray winter. I stood by the sink, my coffee cooling in my hands, and let the warmth brush across my face. The house was silent except for the low murmur of the radio and the creak of the old floorboards under my slippers. There was a stillness I hadn't felt in months, a kind of space opening up inside me, as if something heavy had finally been lifted. The notebook Margaret left rested open on the table, her last page marked with a folded corner. I traced the indentation of her handwriting and wondered how a single word, justice, could change the course of a life. The days after the will reading had passed in a blur, yet each hour felt etched with meaning. Adam hadn't come by, but he'd called twice. The first time, his voice was small, barely above a whisper, full of apologies and regret. The second time it was steadier, but there was a distance in his tone, a kind of shame he didn't know how to hide. He said he was moving out of the house he and Emma shared, selling the car, starting over. He thanked me for protecting what mattered, and before I could answer, he hung up. I didn't try to call back. Some wounds need silence to heal, and I suspected we both understood that. Emma's absence was even louder. I saw her car once, parked across the street late at night, headlights off, engine running. She didn't come to the door. I stood behind the curtain and watched the taillights fade. Part of me wanted to confront her, to ask her if any of it had ever been real, but I let her drive away. That was the last time I saw her. I poured a second cup of coffee and sat at the table, spreading out the charity's first letter on the placemat. It was a simple, typed thank you from the director, a woman named Joy, telling me how Margaret's gift had saved the pediatric oncology wing from closing. The numbers were stark. 6 beds, 8 children, a new nurse hired. I read the words twice, a slow smile growing across my face. The money Margaret had worked for, the sacrifices she'd made, had become something that would last beyond any of us. Her legacy was secure, not in the hands of those who would waste it, but living on in children who might never know her name. The air that morning was thick with memory. I found myself reaching for the phone to call Margaret, to share the news, then caught myself and laughed softly at the old instinct. Instead, I grabbed her notebook and stepped outside. The sun was already climbing, burning off the last of the mist from the grass. I walked to the park a few blocks away, the same park where Margaret and I used to watch Adam chase kites or eat ice cream on sticky summer nights. The benches were still the same, paint peeling, initials carved deep into the wood. I sat beneath a young oak and let the memories come, not fighting them. I thought about all the things Margaret had taught me, how to find meaning in struggle, how to forgive but not forget, how to stand up for what was right even when the cost was high. Her voice echoed in my mind, urging me forward, reminding me that justice isn't always clean, and love isn't always gentle. Sometimes, the truest act of love is letting someone face the consequences of their choices. I saw Adam a week later, not at my door, but at the supermarket down the street. He looked thinner, a little older, wearing the same battered jacket I'd given him years ago. He approached slowly, hesitating as if waiting for permission. We talked by the fruit stand, the conversation halting at first, then opening up as the walls between us began to fall. He asked about the house, about the charity, about Margaret. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but I saw in his eyes the same stubborn hope that Margaret had carried. He promised to do better, to be better, and for the first time I believed him. We shook hands, then hugged, a silent agreement that the past would not dictate the future. Life found a new rhythm. I joined Joy and the charity board for coffee at a corner cafe, helping brainstorm new projects. Margaret's spirit seemed to linger in every idea we tossed around. Scholarships for local kids, an after-school reading room, a free clinic in the neighborhood. I didn't know if I was ready to be part of something bigger again, but I found comfort in the work, a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost. Joy invited me to visit the hospital. The pediatric wing was bright and noisy, full of hand-painted murals and the sound of children laughing. I stood in the middle of that whirlwind, blinking back tears, and felt Margaret's presence beside me, quiet but unyielding. I promised her, and myself, that I would do more than just remember her. I would carry her work forward. The house changed, too. I cleaned out Margaret's closet, packing her things with care, setting aside a few mementos for Adam. I found an old Polaroid of the 3 of us at the beach, sunburnt and smiling, and put it on the mantel. I started to cook again, trying her recipes, burning the bread at first but getting it right after a few tries. The air inside felt different, less haunted by loss, more alive with the possibility of new beginnings. But not every day was easy. Some nights, the old ache returned, memories crowding in, regrets whispering from the corners. I let myself feel it. I didn't turn away. I'd learned from Margaret that grief is not a wound to be hidden but a part of love's story, a reminder that what we do matters, even after we're gone. One afternoon in late spring, Joy stopped by with a package, a thank you from the children and staff. Inside was a quilt, each square stitched by a child whose life had been touched by the charity. There were drawings of trees and hearts, a tiny embroidered kite, and in the center Margaret's name. I ran my hand across the fabric and felt tears prick my eyes, but it was not sadness that moved me. It was gratitude. I hung the quilt in the hallway, where the sun would catch it every morning. Adam came for dinner on a Sunday, bringing flowers and a loaf of bread he'd baked himself. We talked long after the plates were cleared, about the past and the future, about forgiveness and what it means to start over. He told me he was seeing a therapist, working to understand where things went wrong. He thanked me for giving him the chance to change, even when it would have been easier to let him go. I told him the truth, that Margaret had left us both a path, but it was up to us to walk it. That night, as I watched him leave, I felt something like peace settle inside me. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The days grew longer, the city greening with the promise of summer. I found myself looking forward, not back. I started volunteering at the hospital, reading stories to the kids on Saturday mornings. Their laughter was bright and reckless, untarnished by the weight of the world. I wondered what Margaret would have made of it all. Her husband, the engineer, stumbling through picture books and puppet shows. I think she would have been proud. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the rooftops, I took Margaret's notebook to her grave. The cemetery was quiet, the air cool and sweet with the scent of lilacs. I sat on the grass, tracing her name on the headstone, and told her everything. The pain and the anger, the choices and the consequences, the new hope growing in the space she left behind. I told her I'd kept my promise, that justice had been done, but that I missed her every day. I left the notebook tucked behind the headstone, a final chapter only she would read. Walking home, I felt lighter. The city around me alive with the sound of children playing, neighbors laughing, the distant hum of cars on wet pavement. I didn't know what would come next. None of us ever really do. But I understood now what Margaret had always tried to teach me. Life goes on, shaped by the choices we make and the courage we find when everything else falls away. Justice is never simple, and love is never easy, but both are worth fighting for. As the last of the sun brushed the sky with gold, I stepped into the house that had held my grief, my hope, and now, at last, my peace.